The philosophy of education is a profound and multi-layered field that seeks to explore, analyze, and interpret the fundamental questions surrounding the nature, purpose, and methods of education. It is not merely an academic discipline, but a vital framework through which societies reflect upon their values, goals, and visions for the future. At its heart, the philosophy of education grapples with questions such as what is the ultimate purpose of education? What should be taught and how should it be taught? Who should be educated and to what end? These questions are not only theoretical but have practical implications that shape educational policy, curriculum design, and classroom practice across the globe. Historically, the philosophy of education has drawn from the broader traditions of philosophical thought, borrowing and adapting concepts from metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and political philosophy. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle laid the groundwork for educational theory by contemplating the relationship between knowledge, virtue, and society. Plato, in particular, envisioned education as the means by which individuals could ascend from ignorance to enlightenment, ultimately contributing to the harmony and justice of the state. His allegory of the cave remains a powerful metaphor for the transformative potential of education, a journey from darkness to light, from illusion to truth. Aristotle, on the other hand, emphasized the cultivation of virtue and rationality through habituation and practice. For him, education was not simply about the transmission of information, but about the development of character and the realization of human potential. This dual emphasis on intellectual and moral growth continues to resonate in contemporary debates about the aims of education. Should schools prioritize the acquisition of knowledge, the formation of ethical citizens, or the preparation of individuals for economic productivity? The answers to these questions depend on one's underlying philosophical commitments. Moving forward in history, the philosophies of education evolved alongside changes in society, technology, and culture. During the Enlightenment, thinkers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau introduced new perspectives on childhood learning and the rights of the individual. Locke's notion of the mind as a tabula rasa, or blank slate, suggested that education could shape individuals in profound ways, emphasizing the importance of experience and environment in the learning process. Rousseau, meanwhile, advocated for a naturalistic approach to education, arguing that children should be allowed to develop according to their innate tendencies, free from the constraints of rigid social expectations. These early modern theories were instrumental in shifting the focus of education from rote memorization and authoritarian discipline to the holistic development of the learner. They also laid the groundwork for later educational movements such as progressivism and constructivism, which continue to influence pedagogical practices today. Progressivism, championed by figures like John Dewey, posits that education should be child-centered, experiential, and democratic. Dewey argued that learning is most effective when it is connected to the lived experiences of students and when schools function as miniature communities that foster collaboration, critical thinking, and social responsibility. Constructivism, another influential paradigm, emphasizes the active role of learners in constructing their own understanding of the world. Drawing on the work of psychologists such as Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, constructivists argue that knowledge is not passively received but actively built through interaction with the environment and with others. This perspective has significant implications for teaching, suggesting that educators should facilitate inquiry, exploration, and dialogue rather than simply delivering information. The philosophy of education is not confined to abstract theorizing, it is deeply entwined with issues of power, justice, and identity. Educational institutions are sites where social norms are reinforced or challenged, where inequalities can be perpetuated or addressed. Critical pedagogy, inspired by thinkers like Paulo Freire, highlights the emancipatory potential of education. Freire argued that traditional forms of schooling often serve to reproduce oppressive structures by treating students as passive recipients of knowledge. Instead, he advocated for a dialogical model in which teachers and learners co-create meaning, empowering individuals to question and transform their realities. This critical perspective invites us to consider whose interests are served by prevailing educational practices and whose voices are marginalized. It raises questions about access, inclusion, and the hidden curriculum, the implicit lessons about power, gender, race, and class that are embedded in school culture. Feminist, post-colonial, and multicultural philosophies of education have further expanded this critique, calling attention to the diverse experiences and needs of learners in a globalized world. At the same time, the philosophy of education engages with perennial debates about the relationship between education and society. Is education primarily a means of socialization, preparing individuals to fit into existing social structures, or is it a force for social change, equipping people to challenge injustice and envision alternative futures? These questions are particularly salient in times of rapid technological and cultural transformation as societies grapple with the demands of globalization, digitalization, and environmental crisis. One of the central tasks of the philosophy of education is to clarify the aims of education. Various philosophical traditions offer different answers to this question. Essentialism, for example, holds that there are certain core bodies of knowledge and skills that all students should acquire in order to become competent members of society. This approach tends to emphasize discipline, authority, and standardized curricula. In contrast, perennialism advocates for the study of enduring ideas and great works of literature, philosophy, and science, arguing that education should cultivate the intellect and transmit the wisdom of past generations. On the other end of the spectrum, progressivism and Reconstructionism prioritize adaptability, creativity, and social engagement. Reconstructionists, in particular, view education as a tool for addressing social problems and promoting justice. They argue that schools should not only transmit knowledge but also foster critical consciousness and collective action. Another important dimension of the philosophy of education concerns the nature of knowledge and learning. Is knowledge objective and universal, or is it constructed and context dependent? Realists maintain that there are truths about the world that can be discovered through reason and observation, while relativists argue that knowledge is shaped by cultural, historical, and personal perspectives. Pragmatism, as articulated by Dewey and others, offers a middle path, viewing knowledge as provisional and evolving, always subject to revision in light of new experiences and evidence. This epistemological diversity has practical implications for pedagogy. A teacher who subscribes to a transmissive model of education may prioritize lectures, textbooks, and standardized tests. By contrast, a constructivist teacher might design project-based learning experiences, encourage collaboration, and assess students through portfolios or performances. The choice of pedagogical methods reflects deeper beliefs about the nature of learning, the role of the teacher, and the purposes of schooling. The philosophy of education also addresses questions of moral and civic education. Should schools aim to cultivate virtues such as honesty, empathy, and respect? What is the role of education in shaping citizens who are capable of participating in democratic life? These questions have taken on renewed urgency in an era marked by political polarization, social fragmentation, and global challenges such as climate change and migration. Some philosophers argue that education must go beyond the transmission of academic knowledge to include the development of ethical judgment, emotional intelligence, and intercultural competence. Others caution against imposing particular values or ideologies on students, advocating instead for a pluralistic approach that respects diversity and fosters open dialogue. The tension between autonomy and socialization, between individual freedom and collective responsibility, lies at the heart of many educational controversies. In addition to its normative and theoretical dimensions, the philosophy of education is concerned with practical questions about curriculum, assessment, and the organization of schools. What subjects should be included in the curriculum, and how should they be sequenced? How can we ensure that assessment practices are fair, valid, and supportive of learning? What is the proper balance between academic rigor and student well-being? These questions require careful reflection on both philosophical principles and empirical evidence. The rise of new technologies has added further complexity to these debates. Digital tools have the potential to democratize access to information, personalize learning, and foster global connections. At the same time, they raise concerns about equity, privacy, and the erosion of face-to-face relationships. The philosophy of education provides a framework for critically evaluating the promises and pitfalls of technological innovation, ensuring that educational practices remain aligned with human values and aspirations. Another key issue is the relationship between education and economic life. In many societies, education is seen as a pathway to employment and social mobility. Policymakers often emphasize the need for 21st century skills such as critical thinking, communication, and adaptability to prepare students for a rapidly changing labor market. However, critics warn that an excessive focus on employability can narrow the aims of education, reducing it to a form of vocational training and neglecting its broader cultural, ethical, and civic dimensions. The philosophy of education thus invites us to balance competing priorities, the needs of individuals and communities, the demands of the economy, and the imperatives of justice, the preservation of tradition, and the embrace of innovation. It challenges us to think deeply about what it means to be educated and what kind of society we wish to create. In considering the global context, the philosophy of education must also grapple with questions of cultural diversity and internationalization. As students and teachers interact across boundaries of language, religion, and worldview, educational philosophies must adapt to new realities. Comparative philosophy of education examines how different cultures conceptualize learning, authority, and the good life, highlighting both commonalities and divergences. This cross-cultural perspective enriches our understanding of education and opens up possibilities for dialogue and mutual learning. Environmental education has emerged as another vital concern, reflecting growing awareness of humanity's interconnectedness with the natural world. Philosophers of education are increasingly called upon to articulate the ethical responsibilities of educators and learners in the face of ecological crisis. What does it mean to educate for sustainability? How can schools foster a sense of stewardship, wonder, and care for the planet? These questions underscore the need for an educational philosophy that is attuned to the challenges and opportunities of the Anthropocene. The philosophy of education is not a static body of doctrine, but a dynamic field that evolves in response to changing circumstances. It is animated by ongoing debates, tensions, and contradictions. For instance, the rise of standardized testing and accountability measures has sparked controversy about the measurement of educational outcomes and the narrowing of curricula. Critics argue that an overemphasis on quantifiable results can undermine creativity, critical thinking, and the intrinsic joy of learning. Similarly, the movement toward inclusive education raises philosophical questions about difference, equality, and belonging. How can schools accommodate the diverse needs and abilities of all learners? What does it mean to create an educational environment that is truly inclusive rather than merely assimilative? These questions require us to interrogate our assumptions about normalcy, merit, and the purposes of education. The role of the teacher is another enduring theme in the philosophy of education. Is the teacher a transmitter of knowledge, a facilitator of learning, a moral exemplar, or a co-learner? Different educational philosophies offer different answers, shaping the expectations placed on educators and the forms of professional development they receive. The teacher-student relationship is a microcosm of broader philosophical commitments, reflecting beliefs about authority, autonomy, and the nature of human flourishing. Parental involvement and community engagement also feature prominently in philosophical discussions of education. To what extent should parents have a say in the content and methods of schooling? How can schools build partnerships with families and communities to support student learning and well-being? These questions highlight the social embeddedness of education and the importance of dialogue and collaboration among stakeholders. The philosophy of education is inherently interdisciplinary, drawing on insights from psychology, sociology, anthropology, and neuroscience. It is enriched by empirical research on learning processes, developmental stages, and the impact of social context. At the same time, it resists reduction to a purely scientific enterprise, insisting on the irreducibly normative and interpretive dimensions of educational practice. One of the strengths of the philosophy of education is its capacity for self-critique and reflexivity. Philosophers of education are acutely aware of the limitations and blind spots of their own traditions, and they continually seek to expand the scope of inquiry. Recent developments in the field include the integration of indigenous philosophies, the exploration of affect and emotion in learning, and the application of postmodern and post-structuralist theories to educational questions. Indigenous philosophies of education offer valuable perspectives on learning as a communal, relational, and lifelong process. They emphasize the importance of storytelling, ritual, and connection to land, challenging dominant models that privilege individual achievement and abstract reasoning. These approaches invite us to reconsider the meanings of knowledge, wisdom, and education in a pluralistic world. The affective dimension of education, how emotions, desires, and relationships shape learning, has also gained prominence in recent years. Philosophers and educators alike recognize that learning is not merely a cognitive activity, but a deeply emotional and embodied experience. Attention to affect opens up new possibilities for understanding motivation, engagement, and the cultivation of caring relationships in educational settings. Postmodern and post-structuralist approaches influenced by thinkers such as Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Gilles Deleuze challenge the idea of fixed meanings, stable identities, and universal truths in education. They draw attention to the ways in which power operates through language, discourse, and institutional practices, inviting a more critical and nuanced analysis of educational phenomena. Despite its diversity, the philosophy of education is united by a commitment to questioning, dialogue, and the pursuit of wisdom. It is animated by the belief that education matters, not only for individuals, but for the flourishing of societies and the planet as a whole. In an age of uncertainty and complexity, the philosophy of education provides a space for reflection, critique, and imagination. In sum, the philosophy of education is a vibrant and evolving field that engages with some of the most pressing questions of our time. It challenges us to think deeply about the purposes, methods, and values of education, to interrogate assumptions and imagine alternatives. By drawing on diverse traditions and perspectives, it enriches our understanding of what it means to teach and to learn, to be human, and to live together in community. As we look to the future, the philosophy of education will continue to play a vital role in shaping the direction of educational practice and policy. It will help us navigate the challenges of technological change, social inequality, and environmental crisis, while keeping alive the ideals of justice, freedom, and human dignity. In doing so, it will remind us that education is not only a means to an end, but an end in itself, a lifelong journey of growth, discovery, and transformation. The enduring questions of the philosophy of education: what is worth knowing? How should we live? What kind of world do we want to create? Remain as urgent and inspiring as ever. By engaging with these questions, we participate in a tradition of inquiry that stretches back millennia and points toward the horizons of possibility. In the end, the philosophy of education invites us to imagine and enact a more just, compassionate, and wise world, one learner, one classroom, one community at a time.